The first thing I like to talk about in doing a body of work that spans over 30 years, and in many ways, all the images are interconnected. There's a reason, and I had to make certain images first before I could actually get to the next image. And that's true for series that I work in, and I work in series, and that's also true for individual images within a series, that I have to make one, and that informs me where to go with another one, et cetera, et cetera. So that process is a process of discovery. It's a process of thinking through how else can you represent something, often representing what you normally think of as unrepresentable. And to me, that's always been a challenge, to look at things where people would normally walk by and never think that there's an interesting image to be had there, whether it's a refinery or a factory or a mine or a quarry. All these things, when I was doing them, nobody was thinking that one can explore this subject as a work of art. And so I started thinking, there's maybe the new landscape, the one that feels more true to my time, is the one that we change. So that began a whole journey of looking at landscapes and how we're shaping the planet. So one of the first things was to go to BC. This is, looking at the mountains and looking at the rich landscape here. But I wanted to look at the rail cut going through the Rockies. This is the CN track. And all of a sudden, this train came by. And I went, oh, check out that train. It's got the same color cargo as the mountain. So it's almost like the mountain's pouring into these bins. And to me, that was like even a richer metaphor, more thought-provoking moment. And so I started looking at mines and thinking about them. And I started researching some of the biggest mines in the world. But what happened when I started to photograph mines at this scale, I began to think that really we are now the agency of change. Nature is now kind of almost been sidelined, and we as the dominant predatory species on the planet are now expanding our footprint around the planet, and we have a voracious appetite. Here's this mine, producing something that each of us probably partakes of on a daily basis, that either on a phone call we've made, or maybe this thing has copper that has come from that mine, that even though we're all connected to these landscapes, we don't even know it anymore, that we're totally disconnected from the products and the materials that we surround ourselves with. Quarries, on the other hand, was a similar thing to mining. So I could stand on one edge of the quarry and look at what 100, or 80 years of quarrying and the residual wall that was left. So you can see all the marks and all the drill marks and all the chips and sometimes numbers and things that have been left behind. So I became totally fascinated with looking at quarries, because in quarries, we're removing stone by the block. It's not just random like blasting ore. You're actually having to cut and take each block out because you want it for its dimensional quality, because that might turn out to be 80% of this was to go to gravestones, and then some was used for granite countertops and some was used for other things, but it was one of the hardest granites in Barrie, Vermont, so a lot of it was going to headstones all across America. What originally was interesting to me is I had seen, the first time I saw Toronto, I was looking at the IMP. I went into the Commerce Court. I don't know if you ever stood there and looked up to all the bank towers. And I remember looking at that bank tower and thinking, oh my God, this is so huge. And there must be something out there in nature that has the equivalence to this. So quarries were this kind of architectonic space, this ability to kind of look at the kind of this notion of a high rise, but going inverted, the yin to the yang. So I started looking and searching for quarries that spoke to that, again, to that collective taking of material from the landscape, but yet also had the metaphor of building towers. And then this one, in many respects, became as one of my last pictures of quarries. And then when I took this one, I said, I don't really need to take it anymore. This has answered that question of a high rise, but growing in reverse. And this had this kind of towering feeling of a high rise. I decided to look at one of the largest industrial projects that China had embarked upon at that time, which is the Three Gorges Dam. So this is an image of, let's see, there's 5 turbines here. They were building 32 turbines. Each one of those turbines was producing 700 megawatts power. So just to give you perspective, most coal burning plants or a nuclear reactor are in the vicinity of about 1,000 megawatts. So that's not quite up to, but it's almost a nuclear power station. Twice the size of any other dam ever attempted. I then started looking at manufacturing. So this is one of the largest factories. It was 22,000 employees, and they were building coffee makers and irons. I think they were making, and George Foreman grills. On the right, they were doing all the form work and all the extrusion, plastic extrusion, and they were even melting aluminum and creating all the plates for the irons. And then on the left, which is the picture I'm going to show you next, is where they assembled everything. When you have, at that time it was 1.3 billion, some say now it's 1.5. But things happen at that scale, and it's very inexpensive labor. And here, for instance, is not a very large, but a kind of an impressive, fairly new factory, and they were cleaning chicken. So this is a chicken cleaning plant where they were creating shish kebabs. And they were doing 100 million chickens a year. And then I started thinking about that, and I said, you know, in China, that's not a lot, because if you think of a chicken feeding, let's say, a family of 4, so 100 million is 400 million meals. 400 million meals is enough food for 1/3 of China's population for one day. So it's for one meal. So you got 1/3 of that, the whole year's production here. All of this, the scale, the speed at which things were being drawn out of nature, was all as a result of really two things: the internal combustion engine and the fact that we figured out how to fuel it with something that we had lots of, which was oil. So this is where oil was first discovered in America, the first gusher around the current oil field. And it's still functioning today, producing almost 1 billion barrels a year. I think they have over 15,000 of these pump jacks. And then here's looking at the oil sands that we're more familiar with. Here's the boreal forest. Now you have the topsoil layer here, and then, of course, just the dirt. They call it overburden. And so they remove that. That's about 15 or 20 feet of, and now they're into the oil sands. These are the benches here. And the reason why, I'm sure many of you know that is controversial, is that the energy necessary to both mine it, because now this is not a pumping operation, this is a full-on mining operation. So you're using a lot of energy to mine it. And then, of course, all the energy it takes, you have to heat the oil sands up to over 80 degrees Celsius to get the sand to separate, which is really what they're doing underground, but now they're mining it. And then the oil separates from the sand and flows over. And then, of course, all of that goes up to refinery, and form is for sure following function. There is no real somebody designing how it's going to look, but these places I found looked amazing. They're like cathedrals of our modern times. So after doing oil, I thought, well, the other great thing, that a liquid that we were totally dependent on, is water. And it presented a lot of issues for me. Like, how do you begin to wrap your head around visually, almost like to represent the unrepresentable again? But here's a case where I was just beginning to work on water, and I heard about the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. I normally don't go in chase of a disaster, but in this case, it was these two themes I've been working on now for a long time: oil and water, and here they are in an unholy alliance together. And then you have this kind of distress on distress. So the green, so this is the Gulf. This is where the Mississippi, empties out into the Gulf of Mexico, and it's known to be a distressed environment. That green is algae because there's so many nitrates and phosphors coming out from the farming industry all through Middle America, and every time there's a big rain, it ends up into the Mississippi. And over that distress, you have the oil. So it's a kind of a double surface of distress, of humans impacting the environment. And the Colorado River Delta, this image is now creating these tree forms because there's no life left. This used to be 1,000 square mile brackish delta with marshes, and now it's a desert. And this is also the same delta. So now the delta has no longer any water. So now that salt dried up on the surface of the desert area. And that tree formation is the fact that water finds its lowest point, and as it trickles down and finds its way back, as the tide recedes, it cuts these tree forms out of the landscape. This is the last take of water. It's called the All-American Canal. So it takes 90% of the water of the Colorado before it makes it over the border to Mexico. Then Mexico takes the last 10%. And this is really an image that really talks about farming and the terraforming that we as humans do. So on the right is what nature intended for that landscape, a desert, and you add water from the Colorado River, and on the left, and now you have a perfect growing condition for alfalfa, and that's what they're mostly growing here. This is just add water, and you get Phoenix. This isn't Photoshop, this is real. So it really does speak to when we divert water, there's always a winner, so the town's the winner, and there's a loser. Mexico isn't getting that water. So this is Holland. I think the stat is over 50% of it is reclaimed from the ocean through looking at making these kinds of sandbars and then draining the water and reclaiming it. So this is total huge water management. They're probably the Uber water managers of the planet. And then ancient water control. So this is a step well in India. These were started in the 12th century. As the monsoons would come, it would fill it up and the water table would go up. And then as the townspeople needed the water, they would walk down the steps and get their pail of water for the town. And now they drill for water in these same regions, and they've drilled below the water tables. So now you see these are totally bone dry. That's the first time that's happened. Another big dam, this is called an arch dam, which is same as a Colorado dam. It used to be called Boulder Dam. What you have here is something that is 6 times the size. So this is about a 14,000 megawatt dam. This shows you a top view looking down on it. So that's a tributary to the Yangtze River. And this is showing you another way in which we now farm. This is using aquifers. And you can really see what's happening. So it's called pivot irrigation. This is about 1 mile in diameter. And this goes around, so you can see it's dropping water on it. And so you can see the evaporation as it gets darker. And that's basically pumping it out of the aquifer, usually at about 500 gallons per minute. And this is kind of showing a progression of what happens once you can no longer draw water from the aquifer. Those circles begin to be absorbed back by the land. So I did a whole series of these of circles barely still holding their form because they ran out of water. Aquaculture, China, again, if you notice there's a theme, I always research to the largest expression. So this is the largest fish farms in the world in China. And I couldn't get airspace, so I used a remote helicopter and got permission to bring it into China to get this view. Sustainable farming, this has been going on for 3,000 years in Yunnan province. So I was also looking at things that we can point to and say, yeah, we can do it. This is 3,000 years old, producing every year, and it'll produce for 3 more thousand years. These things can go on indefinitely. Waterfront, again, this kind of culture of water, that we want to be at the water's edge. So I was looking at it from, this is Cape Coral, one of the largest Army Corps of Engineers man-made canals when they are converting mangrove swamps into suburbs. So swampland in Florida, this is it. But this gives you an idea of what they're harvesting, how they're creating this. So they're just trenching, putting the trenchings onto the land, giving it some elevation, and then building a suburb. But that's the mangrove swamps. This is the largest migration and pilgrimage to water, the Kumbh Mela festival in India. Over 30 million people on one day. So that's like the population of Canada, trying to get to that one bit of water over there, right over there. And the source of water, so for the first time I went back and looked at the pristine landscape. I wanted to find where, like the source of oil, I went to the oil fields, but for water I went to the mountains and I went to BC. And I went up to the north of Smithers, I went to this Mount Aziza and looked at the whole river systems and the purity of those systems. There's still, this water you can still dip a cup into the river and stream and drink it. And then I also went to look at water in Iceland, which is coming out of the mountains in Iceland. Thank you very much.